Okay, looks like we have a good number of people who are prompt, so I like to reward promptness. So with that, I want to thank you for joining the Federal Communications Commission's our tribal webinar to discuss tribal access to wireless spectrum and related data. My name is Bambi Kraus, and I'm the Chief of the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, and we are based in Washington, D.C. The FCC is an independent federal agency responsible for implementing and enforcing America's communications laws and regulations. Through rulemakings and enforcement activities, we regulate communication service providers. Our work covers everything from preventing unwanted calls to emergency alerts to ensuring that persons with disabilities have access to communication services and technologies. Excuse me. Today's webinar will provide an overview of the August 4th of 2023, our public notice seeking comment on how and the extent to which tribal nations and the Native Hawaiian community are able to access wireless spectrum. Comments filed in response to the public notice will enable the FCC to improve its understanding of how and the extent to which tribal nations and the Native Hawaiian community are able to access wireless spectrum. The Office of Native Affairs and Policy is collaborating with our colleagues in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau to offer this webinar. The main presenter from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau is Susan Mort, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief for the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. We have many other FCC staffers who are assisting with this webinar, either in organizing it or to ensure that we have people on hand who can answer your questions. Excuse me. So just a few housekeeping items. Please use the chat function for today's webinar. The chat function is your means to ask questions and seek clarifications. We'll be reading the questions prior to answering as much as possible. And we're here to answer your questions. It would be helpful if you could please insert your affiliation in chat when asking your question. And finally, your microphones are muted. So with that, Susan Mort will lead the presentation and question and answer segment of today's webinar. Susan?
Thank you, Bambi. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. As Bambi said, my name is Susan Mort, and I'm a Deputy Bureau Chief in the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau here at the FCC. Before I joined WTB, I also spent some time in ONAP, so I'm pleased to be back here today with the current ONAP team and to see some familiar names and faces in attendance. Thank you for making time to be with us today. Today, we wanted to share with you and get your input on a public notice that, as Bambi mentioned, WTB and ONAP issued this summer so we can learn more about how tribes are accessing spectrum and related data. But before I get started, I did want to do a quick level set on what I mean by spectrum, as it can mean different things in different contexts. Spectrum, at its most essential, are basically radio waves. Most folks, I think, are familiar with practical applications such as broadcast television and radio, or cell phones and Wi-Fi. All of these are examples of how different types of spectrum, what we call bands, can be used to deliver signals and data from point A to point B. And there's other uses for spectrum too, including for satellites in space and radar systems on the ground that help us predict weather or protect our armed services. Really, at its core, spectrum is a tool that has a lot of potential applications and uses in today's society, including helping to support the delivery of broadband and advanced wireless services. And that's more specifically the focus of what I do on a day-to-day basis, and really the focus to a degree of what we're here to talk about today. So from there, I'd like to focus more specifically on the public notice that we issued and what we're trying to better understand. So if we could move to the first slide, let me start out with an acknowledgement. Thank you, Lloyd. Just start out with an acknowledgement that we recognize that tribal nations and the Native Hawaiian community continue to face connectivity challenges. And the Commission has been very committed in seeking new opportunities and new avenues for addressing this digital divide. So I'm sure you're aware that some of our colleagues elsewhere in the Commission have been working on a number of different initiatives to increase broadband connectivity in tribal communities, including the ACP and different efforts through E-rate in terms of addressing tribal schools and libraries and their connectivity. But one of the other issues that we are looking at is the extent to which tribes or tribally controlled entities currently have access to wireless spectrum. And really kind of what that is, the intent there is in order to assess current and policy future efforts in furtherance of this goal, we kind of need to know what the current lay of the land is. So we currently do collect through our licensing forms and specific information about certain license services, but we're looking to potentially improve our understanding of that, as well as improve our understanding of other means by which tribes and the Native Hawaiian community may be accessing spectrum more indirectly, whether it's through leasing and secondary market arrangements or through unlicensed or lightly licensed services. I'll talk about those last couple of buckets later in the presentation, but if I could start out by really more focusing kind of on some of the more specific issues in this public notice that deal with licensed services. So if we could move to the next slide. So as Bambi mentioned, this public notice that we issued back in August seeks comment on this topic and really does have both some very general questions, but also some specific ones. And the specific ones I'd like to initially hone in on are, again, as I referenced, for various licensed services, we basically, no matter what the licensing regime is for a particular service, at some point, you have to file a license application with us to receive the license. We ask a number of different questions on these licensing forms, but we do not currently have specific granular answers that help us and enable us to better identify and or track tribal or Native Hawaiian applications. So we're going to talk today about some ways in which that we have been looking at and potentially thinking about how we could either add new categories or questions to better identify tribal applicants seeking to obtain or currently holding spectrum licenses. And so I know I just threw a lot of different kind of concepts out at you, but if we could move to the next page. I'd like to maybe get very practical for a minute and give you a couple of real world examples, and then we can go back to some of the questions in the public notice. But hopefully kind of by kind of getting very practical here, that it will help clarify again some of the terminology that I was just using. So again, just before digging into the specific questions again, anytime we have a licensed wireless service, you do have to file an application with us, and this is through a form. The primary form, and we do have multiple ones, but the primary form that we use is FCC Form 601. This is the licensing form that is filed in the first instance to obtain a license, a wireless license. That same form can also be used after a license is obtained for other purposes, including modifications of existing licenses. For example, also updating through an administrative update, the point of contact for a particular license. That's not a change in the licensee name, but if you, for example, when you filed for your original license, have a particular person who's listed in as the point of contact to receive notifications about renewals or other things, you can change who that is and through administrative updates. Also, over the course of a term of a license, when it comes up for renewal, we will also send out reminders about that, and you would need to file a renewal application. So again, the same form can be used over the lifespan of a license for a variety of purposes, including but not limited originally obtaining that license. We do have other forms that are used for assignments and transfers of control when you, for example, if you were to transfer a license to a different entity. But for today's purpose, we'll talk about 601 because it is the primary form. And there are a couple of questions that really do stand out. The form itself, it anticipates a lot of different potential filings. You can actually go to our website. We have all of our various FCC forms listed there and their PDF files. So you could look through and see all the various questions that are on a particular form. But the specific questions that you would have to answer for any given filing will vary, again, depending on what you're filing for. But there are certain ones that are pretty much always going to be on the form. And these are a couple of them. And they are ones that, in looking at the form and based on feedback that we have received in recent years from tribal applicants, we think that there are potentially additional answers or additional terminology that we could add to these forms that, again, would help us to better understand when tribes are applying for and receiving licenses. So again, this is not changing the eligibility for any particular license. This is just when you file for an application or you file your application to get a license, again, just tracking on a going forward basis, because once a license is issued, we basically take the applicant information and then our licensing databases are pulled and populated from that. So, we don't do any independent vetting of that. Again, obviously, all applications filed with us have to be truthful and that they have to be signed. But again, we take the applicant information as received, and that becomes the licensee information, basically. So let's dig into these couple of questions, and I can maybe talk through what both applicants today are doing, but also maybe some options for the future, again, that will give us a little more insight into kind of what I said earlier, the current lay of the land. There is one key difference, though, let me highlight before we dig in here. There's an important difference between these two questions, not just because obviously they're asking different things, but also the first question, question 14, the legal entity type question, is a mandatory question. Question 27, which is on demographics, is an optional question. And we do have different questions that are mandatory or optional, depending on, again, what you're filing for. But what that means in essence is when a question is mandatory, it means that you have to give an answer to it before you can advance through the form and submit your application. So every applicant, whether they're tribal or not, every applicant that files this form has to give us one answer, and it does need to be one answer to the applicant licensee legal entity type question. Again, anecdotally, based on our interactions with a number of different tribes in recent years, they have opted to answer this question in a couple of different ways. So some tribes might, for example, or have opted to select government entity, particularly if the license was to be held by the tribe itself and or a branch of the tribal government. In some cases, however, we got feedback that some tribes felt that that category was really more appropriate for state or local governments, and they opted alternatively to select other, and where you can specify other information about the type of entity. So again, what that means is currently our licensing records do have a number of different licenses held by different tribes, and they are categorized slightly differently. So based on this feedback and kind of our recent experiences, as well as our understanding of, again, some licenses that are currently held by tribes in different types of entities, our thought process was that we could potentially add one or two or three more categories here that would be more tribally focused. And what we're seeking your input on is how we could ensure that, one, we have the right categories, two, that they cover as many possible different type of tribal entities that might hold licenses, and three, really that that we're using the right terminology to really be, again, strike that right balance between being as comprehensive as we can, but also acknowledging the diversity and kind of different fact patterns that can exist out in Indian country. So let me just offer separate from the actual answers and the categories. Again, just a couple of observations about what we already know about some licenses that are held by tribes and tribal entities. So independent of what answer they've actually given us, we know, for example, again, that some licenses have been, the tribes have opted to file for them in the tribe's name itself. So to use one example, the Navajo Nation. Sometimes tribes will have licenses held by different types of government entities other than the tribe itself or the tribal council itself. So a couple of examples of those might be, for example, tribal police, or a school or educational institution, or a health center, for example. Some of those might be part of the tribal government. Some of those might also, though, be just a different type of tribal entity. We also know that there are some licenses held by, for example, business enterprise development companies, which again, they might actually be part of the tribal government, or they might just simply be owned and controlled by the tribal government and might otherwise have their own standalone corporate status. There are also, in some cases, actual direct businesses, so not an enterprise development entity, but for example, a resort or a hotel or a casino. And we have seen a number of different licenses held by those entities as well. And again, kind of, some of those might be owned and controlled by the tribe. Some may not. Some could potentially be, for example, there could be only a minority interest in that type of corporate entity held by the tribe. Or alternatively, there can be situations where there's no direct affiliation with a tribe, but there might be tribal citizens that sit on the board or employees. So I think traditionally speaking, in terms of how we tend to look at ownership and control, we have, not just in the tribal context, generally used a 51% ownership and control as kind of, that is our basic metric in a number of different contexts. So I think in terms of, again, trying to identify and just get a sense of the scope of what tribes themselves are accessing, that would tend to be the metric that we would use. But again, it's a fairly diverse universe of different types of entities that do currently hold licenses and may in the future hold additional licenses. So in crafting additional options for this question, which is one path forward here, so that we could collect more data, we have been thinking about and would very much value your input on what we could do to, again, encompass as much of this diversity as we can. And there's no perfect way of doing this, but really to try to come up with some categories that would cover most of these fact patterns. So I can offer just kind of my own personal perspective, not on behalf of my bureau or the agency, but a few things that we've been brainstorming, just to give you a very practical sense, and just maybe a straw man to work off of in terms of input and feedback. So a couple of options could be something like tribal nation, or tribal nation and or government. There could be another category, for example, that could be tribal entity, or we could phrase it as something like tribally owned and controlled entity. So there is some flexibility here in how we potentially could frame this. Although I would note a couple of things. One is, as you can see on the screen with this first question, the term that we only have so many characters that we can squeeze in. And we already do have a number of different pre-existing options that we'd be looking to retain, obviously, because again, these forms are not just for tribal applicants or for all applicants, but we do want to add in some tribally specific responses, that would help to, again, help us to have more granular and more refined perspective, that would carry through to our licensing records. So it would be particularly helpful, again, to have your thoughts and reactions and specific feedback on what makes sense from your perspective about if we were to include additional categories here to give more flexibility for tribes in responding. So let me pause there for a moment to see if, I'm sorry, I don't have the chat open, but if there are any relevant questions on this before I move to the demographics question.
Well, Susan, just one, and it's a general question. It's,
Sure.
what is the sense on next steps or the timeline for follow-up to the notice?
Well, again, we're optimally would like to get as much fulsome feedback as we can on some of these concepts, which again, we'll carry through and continue and also talk about the broad questions in response to the public notice. I will say and I'll talk about this a little bit later, we do ask some broad questions in addition to these more specific questions about the forms. I would say in the short term, moving forward with any tweaks to the forms, we'd like to do that at our earliest opportunity. And the reason for that is that once we have a decision about what categories we might be able to add, then there are both legal and technical steps that we have to undertake. The reason for that is, and I'll try not to go too deep down a Washington regulatory rabbit hole, but there's this thing called the Paperwork Reduction Act, and we have to get certain approvals anytime we collect information. The good news is if we're just adding new answers to existing questions, it's a slightly shorter process. If we add completely new questions, it's a longer process. But we do have to run those traps. And then, because all of our forms today are online, then we have to undertake technical work to effectuate that once we get the legal approvals. So it takes a little time to, from once we make a decision about what categories to include to actually getting so that it's live and active and that people filing applications would have these options available to them. So we'd like to move forward as quickly as we can. I don't have a specific timeline to offer. It is somewhat dependent on the feedback that we get. As to the broader questions, which we'll talk about a bit later, again, that's I think a longer dialogue. But again, we always very much value tribal input on those. So, but particularly in the short term, if folks are trying to prioritize feedback, I would offer that feedback on these specific form questions and options would be incredibly valuable in the short term.
Well, thank you, Susan. And just so everybody knows, I posted the actual public notice in chat. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, it's much more detailed than what we're providing right now. But that's in chat and you can read it at your leisure. Susan, there's a question about, it's a little more specific than what you just covered. Do you want to finish slides and come back to more specific questions?
Well, I see we're getting some very on point questions. Why don't we take some of these while we're on this topic?
Great. So the first one is a tribal entity considered a government entity, or which choice?
So again, I think that is a little bit up to us to shape, again, the appropriate categories here. What I can tell you is in other contexts, so not in specific to forms, but when we've talked about eligibility for certain things, like the rural tribal window, there we had a rule which specifically defined kind of what we meant by tribal entity. And that meant an entity that was wholly owned and controlled by a tribe. And we also, obviously, tribes themselves were eligible. And so again, I think there was a certain amount of flexibility in terms of, again, for the tribe to self-identify who would be the license holder. And so long as it was one of those, we really didn't, kind of categorize beyond that. And again, the existing form, the question that you see on the screen right now is what the form looked like at that time. So again, people who applied in that window, for example, opted either for government entity or other, because those are the choices we had available at that time. I think we have a little bit of flexibility, again, to to set the categories here and to define them again, simply for purposes of having different legal entity types and tracking them. It's a separate issue as to the actual eligibility. So I apologize. I hope I'm not muddying the waters there in terms of that. But again, I think we have the ability to say, if we wanted to have one category be tribal, nation, or government, or again, whatever the appropriate terminology is, if we wanted to reflect that, one category was more, government focused as opposed to another that was more potentially business focused. And we also have, even though the form itself, obviously, again, there's only so many characters we can get on the form, there are instructions that accompany the form. So we could provide additional guidance in that context, again, to kind of help shape that. So I think we have a little bit of flexibility here. Again, this is just in terms of how applicants will self-identify themselves. It doesn't speak to actually any of the underlying legal obligations in terms of the licensing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think perhaps Sarah Eagle Piper's question was currently, since there isn't a tribal option on question 14, perhaps which one do they usually check? And I think you answered that to say they're either check government or other.
That is historically what we've seen. I will say, to the extent that they are a corporate entity, sometimes they opt for one of the corporate options. But in terms of if it is, again, the tribe itself, the tribal council, different branches of the tribal government, and yeah, those would be the two that we have typically seen.
Which gets to the point of this webinar, which is it doesn't really capture the tribal
nuances. Yeah.
The next question, and if you don't mind putting in your affiliation in chat also, not because I can see your name, but affiliation is helpful. Josh Snow asked, how would you handle wholly owned tribal LLCs? And I'm guessing that goes to the existing question on here that we're looking at.
Well, again, I think as Josh is noting, there is already an LLC category. And again, depending on what more tribally focused categories we also add in as an option. So again, if it's tribally owned or controlled entity or tribal entity, again, that's why we're looking for your input on how to kind of frame these. Again, it would be up to the applicant to select that. And as I think I mentioned earlier, we don't otherwise vet that. So if a tribally controlled LLC, if we have the tribal options and they simply opted for the LLC, because unfortunately, again, we do have to have only one selection here as part of the legal entity type question. Again, that would be the choice of the applicant. And it's not something that we would otherwise vet. So just, it's one thing to note that, and this is true today, and it's true of all of our kind of application information that we receive, it is self-provided by the applicant. So to the extent that we hope that by offering more options here, that will allow us to better sort and analyze our license information and that data, it is dependent on, again, kind of what we receive in the door. So we can, again, kind of help to define the categories, help guidance, but at the end of the day, it's going to be what the applicant chooses and opts for.
Well, I'll ask this question, which is related, is so, for example, we could add a tribal, federally recognized American Indian tribe. Would there be additional options below that? Or is it one and done? Let me know if you want me to explain that.
Yeah, I think what you're asking, Bambi, is would there be subcategories? I think that's
Right.
something I'd have to take back and talk about with our technical teams to see if that's even technically feasible. Because again, we're working within the structure of the system as it's set up. But that's something that we could certainly explore. And if folks, again, if the feedback is such that it would be great if we could do this, we can look at what the art of possible is. But again, I would just note, the more there's a balancing act always inherent in creating any type of form, is that you want to give options, but the more options you have, then it can be, confusing because not everyone goes back and reads the instructions. And again, every applicant will potentially read the form differently. So I think we're always in crafting these questions and crafting our forms, always trying to balance all of those equities. So we want to be as comprehensive as we can be without making it confusing. Because there are a lot of potential fact patterns. We've just talked about some of them here today, and I'm sure there's others out there. So it is a tricky balance to strike. I will note we always have the other category, and that will stay there no matter what. We'll always have an other category so that people who are unsure or uncomfortable with any particular categories have that option available to them.
Thank you. We have one comment, excuse me, that's not a question, but just a suggestion would be to add a category of federally recognized American Indian tribe. And then I think we're current on the questions so far.
Okay, great. Well, that helped us walk through again a couple of fact patterns here and some issues that we have to, I think, anticipate and take into account with the legal entity type question. But let me pivot for a moment to the demographics question, which again is one other question that we, in looking at the totality of the form, identified as a potential vehicle here. I would note again, in my personal opinion, that I think this one is a little bit trickier in a couple of different senses. One is, as I mentioned at the top, this is an optional question. So what that means is you don't have to answer it in order to progress with your application. So that leaves it more open. While this is an area where you could potentially solicit more information, again, because it is optional, what that means is you may not get a fulsome data set coming out of this, meaning that a lot of applicants could just completely skip over it. So that is one challenge. And again, kind of the nature of these questions, meaning the legal entity type being mandatory and demographics being optional. I don't think at this stage we were necessarily looking to change that broadly because again, this application form is for all applicants, not just tribal ones. But again, we could potentially add more subcategories within the demographics question. As you see it now, it already has race, ethnicity, and gender. And again, so that's more oriented towards individual filers. But one thought that we had was that potentially we could have other subcategories that might tease out some more granular specificity. And I think potentially along the lines of what we were talking about earlier, just different fact patterns and more granularity. We didn't, I think, have very specific proposals or strawmen in mind here, but I just note that again, it would probably be something new and different within that question, just because again, we do have individual applicants who might select some of the existing questions, but we could add something that is more entity focused, if that makes sense.
Oh, I'm going to jump in here to give, excuse me, help people understand the nature of all these questions too. Is that for Form 601, are these the only two questions that you could possibly respond to that would indicate whether you are tribal or not?
In terms of the existing form, these are the ones that we currently have. So we could potentially add new questions to the form. The one issue relating to that is, and it goes back to what I was talking about the legal hoops we have to jump through to actually make this happen and execute it. To the extent that you are just tweaking an existing question, that's viewed as a minor modification, so it's a faster approval path. If you add completely new questions, we'd have to consult with all the relevant folks who specialize in this, but our understanding is typically that is viewed as more of a major change, and that is a potentially much longer and more complicated path to modifying the forms and getting the legal approvals to modify the forms. So that is why we have focused in on these pre-existing questions as potential vehicles, because they are, one, they're already there, and two, they are potentially the quickest path forward.
Got it. Thank you.
So if there's no questions about the demographics question, and again, there is that pro and con versus mandatory versus optional to keep in mind. But if we could perhaps advance to the next slide. So these are the specific questions that are actually in the public notice. So these are kind of the more detailed and slightly verbose version of what we just talked about. And so we just, hopefully these now might make a little more sense. And because again, I appreciate that not everyone lives and breathes our forms every single day. But these are the type of considerations that we were trying to solicit comment on, and having seen and kind of walk through those questions, hopefully they make a little more sense. So again, what we're asking about is, legal entity categories, demographic questions, and what would be the appropriate terminology, and to strike that right balance between recognizing the sovereign status of tribal nations and the broad diversity of tribal nations and the Native Hawaiian community. And if we add these additional questions, which path should we go? Mandatory or optional? To be clear, I just want to be clear that with mandatory questions, these are already mandatory. For example, the legal entity question is already mandatory. So we're not trying to add additional burden. What we're actually trying to do is offer more flexibility and more options in responding to that question. But again, there are pros and cons with those two approaches. And then the last question is really, again, what's the right scope of entities that we should be anticipating and or covering with any new categories that we offer. Again, this is not going to restrict or inhibit anybody from otherwise getting a license. It's just about how we would kind of potentially, again, track and categorize this. And again, I just offer the perspective of historically, we've certainly looked at anything that is directly held by a tribe or tribal government entities as controlled by the tribe. When you get into non-governmental entities such as businesses, again, there are complex questions depending on, there's a lot of potential structures that could be covered. Again, historically, I think we've looked at 51% ownership and control is indicia of tribal control. But those are the areas where it would be very helpful to get your input and feedback. And then again, there is this question of also, would it be appropriate to track individual tribal citizens or corporate entities that again are not owned or controlled by tribes? Meaning, if a tribe only has a minority interest, would that be something? Again, that is different, I think, historically, at least how we've looked at it in terms of ownership and control. So those are the long form questions that are in the public notice. If you have any other questions about kind of the scope of what we're looking at or the type of feedback that would be beneficial, please don't hesitate to reach out. But we just want to run through those now kind of with the specific questions in the back of your mind, so that you have a practical sense of what kind of our longer form public notice actually means.
So Susan, could we just spend a couple minutes on these
Sure.
three questions? I try and look at the easier ones to answer. So I'm going to go to question 2, whether it should be mandatory or optional.
Right.
So right now, people who are either applying for a new license or renewing it, they have to check something. Is that right?
For legal entity type, they have to select something because that question is mandatory. They do not have to answer the demographics question. It's optional.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions is whether to make it mandatory if there's a tribal box to check that box. Is that part of this? Is this part of what we're seeking comment on?
I would frame it differently. I would say maybe this is like a top level question of which. Is it better to have a question that's mandatory versus a question that's optional in terms of, again, what the net results are going to be? So forget which question, just in terms of if it's something that you have to answer to file the application versus not. And again, I think the particularly with a mandatory question, what that means is you're guaranteed to get some kind of answer. With optional, you may not get any answer, and therefore you may not have any kind of data or visibility into that applicant. So on today's form, the legal entity type question is mandatory and the demographic question is optional. We could theoretically change, I guess, the status of the demographic question and make that mandatory. But again, historically, we have kept that optional. But again, and keep in mind, this is going to be for all applicants, not just tribal applicants. It's every applicant nationwide. If we were to, for example, even though I said it is a more challenging path, and it is a more challenging path, but if we were to add a completely wholesale new question, the initial thing that I think we would ask is, well, okay, is it whatever that question is it mandatory or is it optional? Meaning, are you going to require a response? And again, that's with a view towards what you get out of it, because if you have a mandatory question, you're guaranteed to get an answer. If it's not a mandatory question, such as currently demographics, you don't necessarily get an answer.
No, I think it's a very important question, and hopefully we'll get some comments on that. I think my concern, just in thinking of how people could respond, is if it's an American Indian who's enrolled in a federally recognized tribe who owns the company, but it's not necessarily tribal, then which box or boxes would they check? I think that, of course, there's any number of ways of looking at this, but
exactly.
Yep.
No, and it again, there's a lot of different fact patterns that we can't potentially anticipate. And again, we don't vet the answer we get. It is applicant self-defined. So we can provide guidance in our instructions, and we can try to structure the categories and the questions to avoid confusion. And we're certainly always available to help answer questions and provide guidance if folks are unsure. But there are a lot of possible fact patterns that could be covered. So it is something to think about.
And it's not one license, one tribe. A tribe or tribal entity can own many licenses.
Indeed, that is the case. That is typically the case. And in fact, even within a tribe, I am thinking of one right now. I won't name names, but I can think of actually many tribes, for that matter, where they might have some licenses in the tribe's name, some licenses in a government department name, other licenses in a business entity name. It's actually pretty common. And there's nothing wrong with that. That is, frankly, that's how corporations do it outside of the tribal context. You can have different licenses held at different levels of any organization, and how, and that happens just practically speaking because people doing their day-to-day jobs just are like, hey, I need a license to do X, Y, and Z. I go out and get it. So it's pretty common to have, even within the same tribe or the same corporate entity, a lot of licenses held in different entity names and at different levels.
Understood. So, was there another slide of questions?
Yes, actually, if we could progress to the next slide. So those, we just went through the specific questions kind of really on the licensing form changes, which were kind of, again, the specific topic where near-term input would be helpful. But we do ask a few broad questions as well, and we would certainly welcome input. Firstly, on secondary market transactions. And what I mean by that are situations where a tribe may not directly hold a license themselves, but they might, for example, lease spectrum from an unaffiliated licensee. There's also secondary market transactions where, that outside licensee might opt to what we call disaggregate or partition a license. So they either break off a geographic area or break off frequencies and then transfer that. So that is a different kind of subcategory of secondary market transactions. And we are aware that these are certainly happening out in the real world, that tribes are involved in these, particularly in leasing arrangements. I should mention that transactions all do have to be filed with us, and to the extent we improve and or add more options onto our licensing forms, there's a licensing form for transfers and assignments and leases. And so we, by virtue of that, we could on a going forward basis get more information about these type of transactions. But I think we also just generally, in anticipation of that, wanted to get a sense of the lay of the land as well, because this, as I said, is a way in which tribes can currently get access to spectrum where they wouldn't necessarily, if they go through a leasing model, directly hold license, but it gives them direct access to licensed spectrum through the lessor. So we do have, as an aside, I should mention, the commission did adopt enhanced competition incentive program that will provide incentives to help spur more of these transactions. We are working through and finalizing implementation of that program, and I hope to have more to say about that kind of next year. But to get a baseline, it would be very helpful to kind of have general input on kind of secondary market transactions, whether they be leasing or otherwise in the short term. And then the other kind of general bucket where we ask some questions about other ways tribes are accessing spectrum involves unlicensed or lightly licensed services. And what I mean by those are, again, we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to spectrum access. We have a number of different bands and services where you do not need to go get a formal license. So, you know, we've talked about these at some workshops in the past about, again, white spaces, certainly Wi-Fi is another one. There are other options, and in the unlicensed space, that's not something that we actively track. We don't have a way because you don't have to get a license, so we don't really have a clear sense of how it's being used by tribes. We know it is happening, though, in part because a lot of tribes who, for example, filed for grants under the NTIA Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program did mention that they are looking at, as part of their efforts to deploy services, are looking at that as one tool in their toolkit. So it's out there, but we don't have a mechanism for actively tracking or better understanding it. So we welcome kind of even anecdotal input on that. The other category I mentioned in this is lightly licensed, or sometimes we call that licensed by rule. It's actually very, very similar to unlicensed. There's some slight legal nuances, which is why I do mention that. It does have a different terminology, even though we tend to lump them together. But lightly licensed or licensed by rule means you don't have to file an application with us to formally get a piece of paper that says, here's your license. But if you comply with certain technical rules, if you, for example, use compliant equipment, and in the case of CBRS or 3.5 gigahertz, which is, I think, the classic example of this, sign up with a spectrum access system, then you are deemed to have a license. So you do get some interference protection as part of that. But if, in effect, whether it's unlicensed or lightly licensed, both of these categories are things that, one, are lower barriers to entry, but also, again, things that we don't really have. Unlike in the license context where we have licensing records to track it, we don't have as a vehicle really to track tribal usage of those. So we do want to better understand how those services are being currently used. And again, we do anecdotally know that they are being used because, again, there were a number of references to 3.5 gigahertz and other kind of licensed by rule services, as well as unlicensed services in those NTIA applications. So I think to the extent that we could better understand how those are being used, that could also help us to promote these access opportunities even more. And also, again, as I mentioned at the outset, all of this is designed to get a sense of the lay of land so that then we can analyze not just our current programs, but potentially future ones down the line. So with that, we could potentially advance to the last slide here. And just talk about more mechanics. And again, let me just emphasize how important tribal input is here, and as always. And we definitely encourage tribal interests to file comments in response to the public notice. They need not be formal or long form comments. It could be in letter form or even informal comments. But having a written record is always more helpful to us. That said, if, you know, at the end here, as we pause, if folks have any informal reactions they want to share with us, we would certainly welcome that as well. Any input here to help shape how we move forward is appreciated. I appreciate that today is November 16th, and when we issued the public notice, we asked for feedback by November 30th. That's not a lot of time left, and I know also Thanksgiving is next week, but again, to the extent that folks are interested in providing input, if in the short term there was specific input on the licensing forms, that kind of would allow us to potentially move forward with that. Certainly some of the bigger picture issues, again, we welcome that input, but we appreciate that might take more time to pull those thoughts together. That said, we did articulate a November 30th deadline. Greatly appreciate any input before then. To the extent that comments come in afterwards, again, that would still be welcomed. But anything that's particularly targeted on the forums, that helps us move that ball forward. If you have any questions about how to submit a filing through our electronic comment filing system, I know both we and WTB and our ONAP colleagues are more than happy to advise. It is an online filing system. The magic thing that you need is the docket number here on the screen, 23265. That is also mentioned in the public notice, which I know Bambi sent the link around for. So again, we welcome any and all inputs, and I'm happy now to pause and again, open the floor for any questions you may have.
Well, thank you, Susan. That was an excellent presentation. And if you could please post your questions in chat, that would be appreciated. I had just one thing to share, and it came up in a workshop at NCI's convention, which I'm still at right now, is unless the FCC refreshes a docket, each docket stands on its own in terms of the comments that are received for it. So something that was submitted to a different docket, even if it's on the same topic, cannot be looked back at it and included in the docket for 23-265. Do I understand that correctly?
That's right. Well, first and foremost, I will just say this public notice in this docket is not a formal rulemaking. This is just a vehicle for us to get your input. To the extent that people have past submissions and other dockets they wanted to cross post here, yes, you know, that would be for us to kind of take into account here. It would need to be cross posted here, but you could certainly resubmit a prior submission or something new. But yes, generally, when it does come to actual rulemakings, I will just say, which again, this is not, but in informal rulemakings, you definitely do have to post in a specific docket in order legally for that to be considered as part of the record in that proceeding. So as a general principle, it's always good to, I would say, make sure that anything is in the right docket.
No, thank you. You really explained that well. We have a few more minutes we'll be here for another 4 minutes. So if people have thought of something else, or maybe we should go back to slide 4. I think those are the 2 existing questions on form 601. And the public notice is in chat. It's also on the ONAP website for those of you who want to quickly find it. I think we've been pretty thorough on the questions and the opportunities that exist with this. And there are certain parameters in terms of how complicated, which means it might take longer to update it.
But if folks have thoughts or reactions or questions after the fact, please feel free to reach out, and we'll be happy to address them. So sometimes I always think of something later, so just want to offer that opportunity.
So we did get a new question. I'll just read it quickly. Is there a difference for purposes of the FCC if tribe is federally recognized or not?
So generally speaking, I think for different rules and policies that that the FCC, different rules, policies, and programs that we have, generally speaking, federal recognition is one of the indicia that we typically look at. That's not to say that a state recognized tribe can't apply for a license. I just note that, again, whether it's one of our support programs or other opportunities that we've had historically, I think part of the definition or eligibility requirements has been that it's a federally recognized tribe. But again, what we're talking about here isn't about eligibility. It's just about self-identification on an application form. And those really are distinct, if that makes sense. But it is, I think, a relevant question, though, for even for self-identification. Is that something that, for example, in a demographics or other question, you know, is that an optionality you want to offer, just again, just so that people can identify? But again, I think typically if you went to one of our different programs or opportunities that we've had, usually just by virtue of being a federal agency and kind of the federal trust responsibility, I think we've looked at federally recognized tribes generally in those contexts.
Yeah, I understand, and I agree, Susan. I don't see a follow-up slide for if you have questions, who to contact. I'll put the general ONAP email here in chat, but if you forget or if chat disappears, you can also send a message to tribalevents@fcc.gov, and we'll make sure we forward those to Susan and her team. But we're here to, you know, help you provide comment, and we look forward to seeing some comments from tribes that will help us better understand how important these questions are. So Susan, I don't know if you have any closing comments. I'll give you that.
No, just thank you. A big thank you to everybody in attendance today, and we look forward to any input that you're able to provide.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to Lloyd Collier for helping out with the webinar, and hopefully we'll be reading some comments soon. Have a great day, everyone.